In the quiet drift between waking and dreaming, imagine stepping into a world softened by distance, wrapped in a haze of half-remembered stories and unanswered questions. The era we so often call the Dark Ages sits there, at the edge of collective memory, shaped less by what we know and more by what was forgotten. Before we explore its landscapes, it helps to pause and feel the weight of the name itself. Dark, mysterious, obscured. It suggests a time without progress, a world without learning, a long night in human history. Yet the deeper we look, the more this darkness begins to feel like a shadow cast by later generations rather than the glow of the era itself. The journey begins not with chaos, but with the silence of centuries that were never recorded fully, leaving modern minds to fill those gaps with assumptions. When people hear Dark Ages, they imagine the collapse of civilization, flickering torchlight in ruined halls, and entire peoples stumbling through ignorance. But these are images painted long after the fact, shaped by Renaissance thinkers who wanted their own age to shine more brightly by contrast. The darkness, it seems, lies not in the era, but in the absence of its storytellers. When we step closer, the shadows soften, and a more nuanced world emerges, fragile, yes, but not devoid of light. To sink into this time is to enter a mosaic of shifting borders, fading empires, and enduring human spirit. It was a world uncertain, yet not empty. People worked their fields, tended their herds, passed on traditions, told stories of firesides, and built their lives in the lingering echo of Rome. There were no neat categories or clean transitions. Instead, there were subtle changes, unfolding slowly, like dawn creeping across a misty landscape. The term Dark Ages collapses all that complexity into a single metaphor, turning centuries of lives into a dim blur. But history, like night, contains stars that only reveal themselves when your eyes adjust. As we begin this exploration, imagine Europe not as a void, but as a continent holding its breath. Rome's institutions had weakened, but the people had not vanished. Trade slowed, but it never fully stopped. Literacy declined in many regions, yet knowledge survived in cloisters where tired hands copied fading texts by candlelight. The darkness was not uniform. It was uneven, patchy, like clouds drifting across the moon. There were places of decline, yes, but also pockets of resilience, innovation, and adaptation. History often favors grandeur. Empires, battles, kings, but the quiet persistence of ordinary people forms the true heartbeat of this time. There is a certain peace in imagining these forgotten centuries not as empty voids, but as chapters written in softer ink. Their details require patience to uncover. Archaeologists sift the soil for broken pottery, lost brooches, ancient seeds. Historians trace faint lines in manuscripts altered by countless hands. Linguists follow the evolution of words like footprints across time. Together, these traces reveal a world less dramatic than legend suggests, but far richer in texture. The mystery lies not in sensational secrets, but in the gentle realization that many truths simply slipped away before they could be preserved. And so the shadows persist. They are not frightening, but intriguing, inviting us to wonder what else lies beyond the reach of the written record. Perhaps the darkness comes from a human desire for clarity, for neat timelines, and unmistakable turning points. The early medieval centuries refused to offer such certainty. They stir with contradictions, an age of hardship, but also creativity, of fragmentation, but also renewal. The more we listen to its quiet, the more we hear the soft rustling of change beneath the surface. This moment of beginning is a chance to let go of inherited assumptions and approach the era with gentle curiosity. The darkness need not represent ignorance. Instead, it can be understood as a space of possibility, a landscape where mystery and history intertwine. When the written light grows faint, imagination fills the margins, not to distort the past, but to acknowledge the limits of what we can know. In these blurred edges lie some of the era's most compelling stories. As we step deeper into this forgotten world, we will uncover the strands of truth hidden in the shadowed corners of Europe's past. Some will challenge familiar narratives. Others will illuminate ideas long obscured. Each piece helps us see that the so-called Dark Ages were not a single, uniform night, but a twilight, dim yet alive, uncertain yet unfolding toward dawn. And with that realization, the path ahead grows clearer. The journey begins not in darkness, but in quiet curiosity, ready to reveal what history never fully told us. When the mighty city of Rome faltered, it did not crumble overnight, nor did its legacy vanish into smoke and dust. The fall of Rome is often painted as a cataclysmic event, an abrupt end to order and civilization, leaving Europe to descend into chaos. In truth, the reality was far more intricate and nuanced, a gradual unraveling rather than a dramatic collapse. The empire had long been stretched thin, its borders exposed to the restless movements of peoples from distant lands. Internal strife, political corruption, economic strain, and repeated invasions slowly weakened the structures that had once seemed unshakable. Yet life did not stop. The rhythms of daily existence, work, worship, family, continued in towns, villages, and the countryside. The fall was not the silence of everything ending, but the quiet transformation of institutions, economies, and ways of life. Across the provinces, the echoes of Rome lingered in unexpected ways. Roads remained in use, though less maintained. Villas and towns persisted, though populations shifted. Latin, the language of administration, survived in scribes' manuscripts, law codes, and the rituals of the church. Local leaders stepped into the vacuum left by distant emperors, creating a patchwork of authority that was far from uniform, but maintained some semblance of order. This was not a Europe devoid of civilization. Rather, it was a continent in flux, caught between memory and adaptation. In some regions, continuity persisted for generations, as rural communities clung to Roman farming techniques, irrigation methods, and social structures, while urban centers slowly transformed under new rulers and influences. The narrative of sudden catastrophe is further complicated by the fragments of surviving texts. Chronicles often describe invasions in dramatic, almost apocalyptic terms, but these accounts are themselves filtered through the eyes of monks, bureaucrats, and storytellers who had their own reasons for emphasizing calamity. Each invasion by Goths, Vandals, or Huns is recorded not only as a military episode, but as a moral lesson, a warning about divine judgment or human folly. The challenge is to read between the lines, to discern the difference between the reality of shifting power and the stories told about it. In this space between fact and interpretation, mystery emerges. We cannot know precisely how ordinary people experience the changes. Yet archaeology, letters, and remnants of material culture provide glimpses into their resilience. Even as the structures of empire waned, new forms of power and community began to emerge. Local chieftains, tribal assemblies, and nascent monarchies gradually filled the void left by imperial authority. The fragmentation of power created both instability and opportunity. Alliances shifted, territories were claimed and lost, and the map of Europe became a constantly changing mosaic. This contrast between the grandeur of empire and the fragile, adaptive local systems defines much of the early medieval period. The story is not one of decline alone, but of transformation, a recalibration of political, social, and cultural norms that would shape the continent for centuries to come. Yet there is mystery in the gaps, in the centuries where few records survive. Certain regions are shrouded in silence, leaving historians to speculate on population sizes, migration patterns, and cultural practices. Monasteries, often the preservers of knowledge, were themselves scattered and vulnerable, subject to raids, fires, and neglect. What texts, stories, or innovations might have been lost forever. Each fragment that remains becomes a precious clue, a window into lives and events that would otherwise be forgotten. In this way, the so-called Dark Ages are illuminated not by the abundance of evidence, but by the delicate traces that persist against time's erosion. The cultural life of the post-Roman world was equally complex. Pagan practices lingered even as Christianity spread, creating a landscape of spiritual coexistence, tension, and transformation. Artistic expression continued, sometimes subtly infused with classical traditions, sometimes entirely new in style and intent. Architecture, though simplified in some cases, retained the imprint of Roman engineering while adapting to new materials and social needs. This interplay between continuity and innovation, between preservation and adaptation, reveals a world that is far from static, far from entirely dark. As we examine the fall of Rome not as a sudden catastrophe, but as a slow, uneven transition, the notion of the Dark Ages begins to shift. Rather than a void, we see a period of transformation, where the familiar glow of Rome's institutions dims but does not disappear. Life carries on, and in the quiet persistence of ordinary people, new societies begin to take shape. This perspective challenges the dramatic imagery of collapse and opens the door to deeper questions. How did these emerging communities reinterpret the legacy of Rome? How did memory, myth, and survival intertwine to shape the centuries that followed? The story of Rome's fall is therefore a tale of contrasts. Public grandeur versus private survival. Documented events versus lost experiences. Sudden invasions versus slow adaptation. It invites us to reconsider what fall truly means. Not an end, but a transformation, a reorganization of power, culture, and human resilience. The mystery deepens when we realize how much remains unknown, how the lives of countless individuals passed without record. And yet, in this uncertainty, the stage is set for the next chapter, where new kingdoms rise from the remnants of old empires, carrying fragments of the past into an uncertain but unfolding future. In the centuries following the decline of Rome, there arose a silence so profound that it shaped the way generations would imagine the past. This silence was not an absence of life, but an absence of record. Many manuscripts, official records, and personal letters were lost to fire, pillaging, neglect, and the slow decay of materials that could not endure the centuries. Libraries once teeming with knowledge became scattered collections of fragile parchments, many of which disappeared entirely. The voices of entire communities vanished, leaving modern historians to reconstruct their lives from fragments, from artifacts unearthed in fields, from inscriptions barely legible on stones. In this quiet, the human imagination has often filled the gaps with assumptions, myths, and dramatic images of empty, desolate landscapes. Yet when we look closely, the silence itself becomes a form of narrative, hinting at the fragility and resilience of knowledge. The loss of records was compounded by the tumultuous social and political changes of the time. As new kingdoms rose and fell across Europe, battles, migrations, and raids consumed the energy of communities, leaving little attention for chronicling everyday life. In the midst of these upheavals, monastic communities preserved fragments of knowledge, copying texts by candlelight and maintaining archives in quiet corners of abbeys. These scribes were selective in their work, often focusing on religious texts or works that reinforced the moral and political ideals of their patrons. Secular literature, practical manuals, and local histories were far more vulnerable, leaving vast gaps in our understanding of ordinary life. The contrast between what was recorded and what vanished creates a haunting tension. A world of knowledge exists, yet so much has slipped through our grasp, leaving a patchwork of glimpses and shadows. The missing records also amplify the mystery of the period. Archaeologists find traces of cities, roads, and dwellings, but the people who inhabited them remain largely anonymous. Coins, pottery, and tools speak volumes about trade, diet, and craft, yet the intentions, dreams, and stories of those who used them are lost. The silence invites speculation. Which ideas, inventions, and stories might have existed but never survived? Which cultural practices faded without a trace? leaving only subtle influences in the languages, place names, and customs that endure. In this way, the absence of evidence is itself compelling, a quiet challenge that draws us deeper into the investigation of what life was truly like. The process of knowledge preservation was uneven and fragile. Some regions benefited from relatively stable monastic centers or court-sponsored scribes, while others experienced repeated upheaval that obliterated records. The survival of texts often depended on chance. A single library spared from fire, a scribe choosing to copy a manuscript for personal devotion, or the transport of a codex to a safer location. These small acts of preservation determined which ideas would reach the future and which would vanish forever. It is remarkable that, despite such fragility, any continuity of thought survived at all, allowing fragments of classical learning, scientific knowledge, and literary expression to endure. This silence also shaped historical perception. Later historians, writing centuries after the fact, encountered gaps and ambiguities that invited exaggeration or moralizing. The absence of evidence became interpreted as evidence of absence, feeding the myth of a dark age devoid of intellectual or cultural life. Yet when modern research combines archaeology, paleography, and cross-disciplinary studies, a more complex picture emerges, an era of adaptation, survival, and subtle innovation. The contrast between the silence of lost records and the fragments that remain highlights how precarious our understanding of history can be and how easily assumptions can fill the void. Amidst the lost voices, certain figures and texts shine as rare beacons. Religious scholars, local leaders, and travelers left behind traces of thought and action, offering glimpses into moral frameworks, political ideals, and social structures. Some manuscripts survive only because they were recopied in distant monasteries. Others were preserved in the margins of texts that seem unrelated to the knowledge they carry. These fragments hint at a richer intellectual and cultural life than previously imagined, yet the gaps remain vast. In the quiet between these fragments lies a profound sense of mystery, a reminder that much of human experience remains forever hidden, whispering rather than speaking outright. In these silent years, ordinary people carried on with the rhythms of life, largely unrecorded. Farmers tended their fields. Artisans shaped clay and metal. Families nurtured children, and communities celebrated festivals and rituals. Though invisible in historical records, their lives formed the backbone of society. The contrast between the dramatic events recorded by chroniclers, battles, conquests, and royal decrees, and the steady, unrecorded pulse of daily existence illustrates the limits of history. We see the grand arcs of kingdoms and empires, but the quiet resilience of everyday life persisted alongside the upheaval, leaving only subtle traces for modern eyes to uncover. Yet within this silence lies an invitation. It encourages us to approach the past with humility and curiosity, recognizing that history is not merely a collection of written words, but a tapestry woven from artifacts, architecture, and human behavior. By piecing together these fragments, we can glimpse patterns of continuity, adaptation, and innovation that illuminate a world too often dismissed as wholly dark. The gaps in knowledge, the missing texts, and the anonymous lives all contribute to a sense of mystery that makes this period compelling, not simply as a backdrop to later eras, but as a world alive in its own right, shaped by survival, creativity, and human endurance. As we move beyond the silence, we begin to encounter the lived experiences that endured behind it. The people whose daily labor, beliefs, and imagination kept societies functioning. This is where history begins to reassert itself, not through monumental events or famous names, but through the subtle textures of existence that survive the passage of centuries. In acknowledging what was lost, we also learn to see the resilience, the ingenuity, and the quiet brilliance that existed in a time often misunderstood. The Dark Ages, when examined closely, emerge not as a void, but as a landscape of hidden stories waiting patiently to be discovered, understood, and remembered. Even as the echoes of Rome faded, new powers began to stir across Europe, quietly reshaping the continent in ways that would define the medieval world. The vacuum left by imperial authority allowed the rise of small kingdoms, tribal confederations, and regional lords, each carving out their own spheres of influence. Unlike the centralized bureaucracy of Rome, these new rulers relied on personal loyalty, kinship ties, and local custom to maintain order. The political landscape was patchwork and uneven, marked by both fragility and flexibility. Boundaries shifted frequently, alliances were forged and broken, and authority was often contested. Yet through this seeming chaos, the foundations of future nations were taking shape. The so-called Dark Ages were, in reality, an era of experimentation and adaptation, where power was decentralized but alive, vibrant, and dynamic. In the north, the Germanic tribes that had migrated into former Roman territories began to establish kingdoms that combined Roman administrative traditions with their own customs. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Franks in Gaul each developed unique systems of governance, blending the remnants of Roman law with tribal codes and emerging Christian institutions. These hybrid political structures illustrate a fascinating tension between continuity and change. The world of Rome did not vanish, but it was transformed to suit new social realities. Leaders like Clovis of the Franks would eventually consolidate power in ways that hinted at the future medieval monarchies. Yet the path was far from straightforward. Kingdoms rose and fell with remarkable speed, often disrupted by internal disputes, external invasions, or economic stress, revealing the precariousness of early medieval rule. In the British Isles, the collapse of Roman authority left a particularly fragmented landscape. Local chieftains and emerging kingdoms such as Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex competed for dominance, while waves of settlers, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, brought new cultural and linguistic influences. Celtic traditions persisted in some regions, mixing with Germanic customs in others. This cultural layering created a rich, yet complex, social fabric, one that historians often struggle to reconstruct due to scarce written sources. The contrast between recorded battles and the everyday lives of villagers underscores a pattern repeated across the continent. Political transformations often dominate historical memory, but they coexist with quieter, persistent patterns of life. Across northern and eastern Europe, Slavic tribes were establishing communities along rivers and fertile plains, often beyond the reach of early medieval chroniclers. These societies maintained oral traditions, seasonal rituals, and communal governance that shaped local identities and social cohesion. Trade networks began to re-emerge, connecting distant communities through the exchange of salt, furs, and other commodities, long before formalized states could enforce laws or taxes. In these regions, we see the interplay between isolation and connectivity, between survival in remote landscapes and the gradual integration into broader political and cultural systems. The spread of Christianity played a pivotal role in consolidating new political powers. Missionaries and bishops often serve as intermediaries between local rulers and the wider Christian world, promoting literacy, moral frameworks, and administrative skills. Monasteries emerged as centers of learning and record-keeping, preserving fragments of classical knowledge while producing new works of theology, philosophy, and law. Religious institutions helped stabilize regions that might otherwise have been consumed by constant conflict. The blending of political authority with spiritual legitimacy became a hallmark of early medieval governance, reinforcing the contrast between temporal power and divine sanction. Yet the rise of kingdoms and local powers did not eliminate uncertainty. Invasions by Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens disrupted settled life, reminding us that the post-Roman world was not uniformly peaceful. Coastal and riverine communities lived under the constant threat of raids, and fortifications became vital to survival. Despite these dangers, societies adapted. Fortified settlements, watchtowers, and militia networks emerged, demonstrating human resilience in the face of instability. The era's challenges were not only military, but also social and economic, as communities balanced survival, trade, and cultural continuity amidst frequent disruptions. The contrast between fragmentation and emergent order defines the early medieval political landscape. Unlike the monolithic empire that preceded it, this world was decentralized, heterogeneous, and experimental. Each kingdom, tribe, or principality developed solutions suited to its environment, resources, and social structures. The stories of rulers and warriors dominate historical accounts, but the resilience of ordinary communities, the farmers, artisans, and villagers, was equally essential in maintaining stability. Their labor, traditions, and innovations quietly underpinned the political transformations that historians often focus on. Moreover, these emerging powers were not isolated. Diplomatic marriages, alliances, and trade fostered networks of connection across great distances. Knowledge of law, metallurgy, agriculture, and religious practice traveled alongside goods, influencing distant regions in subtle ways. Cultural exchange, often invisible to traditional historical narratives, wove a web of continuity across the fragmented landscape, ensuring that the legacy of Rome, local traditions, and new innovations could coexist. These interactions remind us that the Dark Ages were not a void, but a living, interconnected world. The rise of early medieval kingdoms also created a fertile ground for myth, legend, and storytelling. Rulers cultivated narratives of divine favor, heroic ancestry, and moral authority to legitimize their claims. Chronicles written in monasteries often blurred the line between history and legend, embedding moral and political lessons within stories of conquest, piety, and justice. These narratives became part of the collective memory, shaping perceptions of the era for centuries to come. Here, we see the interplay of fact and myth, history and imagination, contributing to the enduring mystique of the period. As power solidified in some regions and faltered in others, the stage was set for further transformations in culture, trade, and intellectual life. The story of early kingdoms is one of adaptation, experimentation, and survival, where human ingenuity navigated a landscape of both opportunity and danger. By examining these emergent powers, we begin to see the contours of medieval Europe, revealing not a landscape of darkness, but one of subtle illumination, defined by resilience, complexity, and the quiet persistence of human endeavor. The Dark Ages, in this light, emerge as an era of formation, laying the groundwork for the stories, kingdoms, and ideas that will unfold in the centuries to come. Trade in the early medieval world was both fragile and vital, a lifeline connecting communities across a landscape often marked by instability. The collapse of Roman infrastructure had disrupted established networks, but commerce never disappeared entirely. Roads, rivers, and coastal routes continued to carry goods, ideas, and people, though the pace was slower and the routes more localized. Markets emerged in towns and villages, serving as gathering points not only for exchange of commodities, but for the flow of information and culture. Goods such as salt, grain, wine, and pottery traveled surprisingly long distances, and luxury items like silk, spices, and jewelry moved along more tenuous channels, connecting Europe to distant regions. Trade became a subtle indicator of continuity and adaptation, a reminder that even amid political fragmentation, human societies remained interconnected. In the north, the emergence of Viking trade networks illustrates the dual nature of commerce and conflict. These seafarers were both raiders and merchants, navigating rivers and seas to exchange furs, amber, slaves, and silver across vast distances. Their journeys reached into the British Isles, the Frankish lands, and even into the Byzantine Empire and the Middle East. The Vikings exemplify the flexibility of trade during this period. Commerce was inseparable from mobility, and mobility was inseparable from risk. The movement of goods brought new ideas, technologies, and cultural influences, subtly reshaping local economies and social structures. Even in regions threatened by raids, trade persisted, demonstrating a remarkable resilience and adaptability in the face of danger. Southern Europe experienced its own commercial revival, often centered around former Roman cities that retained some infrastructure and strategic importance. Italian port cities, such as Venice and Amalfi, began to flourish as intermediaries for Mediterranean trade, connecting the continent with North Africa, the Levant, and beyond. Merchants in these hubs navigated complex networks of political allegiances and tolls, negotiating access to markets and safe passage for their cargo. Trade was more than economic. It was a cultural conduit, transmitting ideas, artistic influences, and religious practices across long distances. The exchange of material goods became inseparable from the movement of knowledge and belief, linking communities that otherwise might have remained isolated. On a more local scale, rural markets were crucial to daily survival. Peasants and artisans brought surplus goods to weekly fairs, exchanging food, tools, textiles, and livestock. These gatherings served not only practical economic functions, but also social ones. News, stories, and traditions circulated alongside tangible goods. In regions where written records were scarce, oral communication at markets became a key medium for preserving and transmitting knowledge. Trade, therefore, was not a distant, abstract phenomenon, but an intimate, lived experience, shaping everyday life as much as it influenced kings and kingdoms. The resilience of trade was also supported by monetary and economic adaptations. Coins minted by emerging kingdoms, though often limited in circulation, facilitated commerce and symbolized authority. Barter remained common in areas where currency was scarce, illustrating the flexibility of economic practices. Markets and fairs became structured spaces for exchange, reflecting a slow reorganization of economic life after the disruption of imperial systems. This uneven recovery of commerce highlights the contrast between decline and continuity. While some regions struggled with instability, others found ways to adapt and thrive, ensuring the survival of economic networks that would eventually expand into the medieval trade systems of later centuries. Trade networks also carried cultural and technological innovations. The spread of metalworking techniques, agricultural tools, textile methods, and artistic motifs often followed the same routes as goods. Ideas traveled alongside silver and salt, creating subtle shifts in social and material culture. Religious and political concepts moved in parallel, with clergy, diplomats, and traders acting as intermediaries for knowledge and practice. In this way, commerce was not merely transactional. It became a vector for cultural transmission, weaving together disparate communities and laying the groundwork for shared European identities. The contrast between periods of disruption and flourishing trade highlights the adaptability of human societies. Even in times of political instability, people found ways to connect, to exchange, and to innovate. Markets and fairs, rivers and ports, caravans and ships all became arteries of continuity, ensuring that the pulse of civilization persisted. While chroniclers often focus on battles and rulers, the story of trade reveals the quiet, persistent ingenuity that allowed communities to endure and even prosper. Moreover, trade helped shape social hierarchies and relationships. Wealth accumulated through commerce supported local elites, who in turn protected routes and markets, legitimizing their power and authority. At the same time, craftsmen and merchants carved out spaces of relative independence within emerging political structures, influencing local economies and contributing to cultural vibrancy. The interaction between economic activity and social organization demonstrates how deeply interconnected the various aspects of early medieval life were, with trade serving as both practical lifeline and cultural bridge. The era's commerce was thus a story of contrasts: fragility and resilience, isolation and connection, risk and reward. Trade illuminated the contours of a continent in transition, linking villages to cities, kingdoms to distant lands, and ordinary people to broader networks of exchange. It reminds us that the so-called Dark Ages were not a period of total stagnation, but a time of adaptation, experimentation, and quiet continuity. Through the flow of goods, ideas, and human ingenuity, we begin to see the hidden networks that kept societies alive, laying the groundwork for the thriving economies and cultural exchanges that would characterize later medieval Europe. Religion in the early medieval world was not merely a matter of personal belief. It was a powerful force that shaped politics, culture, and daily life. As the Roman Empire receded, Christianity continued to spread, gradually becoming the connective tissue across the fractured European landscape. Monasteries, cathedrals, and churches were not just places of worship. They were centers of learning, hubs of communication, and sanctuaries in times of conflict. Religious leaders often wielded influence equal to that of kings, guiding not only spiritual matters, but also political decisions, legal systems, and social norms. The intertwining of faith and power created a delicate balance. Belief inspired devotion and moral order. It was also used as a tool to consolidate authority, legitimize rule, and unify diverse communities under shared practices and narratives. Monastic communities were the heartbeat of intellectual life during this period. Within the quiet walls of abbeys, monks meticulously copied manuscripts, preserving fragments of classical knowledge, religious texts, and local histories. This painstaking work was carried out by candlelight, often in isolation, yet its impact resonates centuries later. These scribes became guardians of human memory, bridging the gap between the lost legacies of Rome and the emerging medieval world. Monasteries also functioned as centers for education, agriculture, and healthcare, reflecting a holistic approach to communal life. In a time when secular infrastructure was inconsistent, religious institutions offered stability, continuity, and a framework through which both rulers and ordinary people could navigate uncertainty. Christianity's spread also brought profound cultural transformation. Missionaries traveled great distances, translating texts, adapting rituals to local customs, and creating communities of shared belief in previously pagan regions. Saints' cults, relics, and pilgrimage sites became focal points for devotion, attracting visitors from far and wide. Religious festivals punctuated the agricultural calendar, providing rhythm and meaning to daily life, while liturgical practices reinforced moral and social norms. This fusion of spiritual guidance, education, and social cohesion illustrates how deeply religion permeated the texture of society, shaping behaviors, values, and interpersonal relationships across a diverse and often unstable landscape. Yet religion was not uniform or uncontested. Pagan traditions persisted in many areas, often blending with Christian practices in ways that were both subtle and enduring. Folk rituals, seasonal celebrations, and localized beliefs coexisted alongside formal Christian observance, creating a layered spiritual landscape. The tension between continuity and transformation highlights the contrast between what was inherited and what was newly imposed. Religious authorities navigated this complexity, sometimes adapting local customs into Christian practice, at other times enforcing doctrinal orthodoxy, resulting in a dynamic interplay between belief, culture, and power. Political leaders frequently leveraged religion to reinforce their authority. Kings and nobles aligned themselves with the church, endorsing religious institutions and participating in public rituals to legitimize their rule. Ecclesiastical endorsement could unite a fragmented populace or justify territorial claims, illustrating the inseparability of spiritual and temporal power. At the same time, the church relied on secular support to expand its influence, acquire lands, and protect its communities from external threats. This reciprocal relationship underscores the intricate networks of influence that structured early medieval society, where power and faith were mutually reinforcing forces shaping the trajectory of history. Religious texts themselves were both guides and instruments. The Bible, theological treatises, and hagiographies offered moral frameworks and spiritual instruction, while also serving as models of literacy, rhetoric, and artistic expression. Illuminated manuscripts, adorned with intricate designs and symbolic imagery, reflected the reverence afforded to sacred knowledge and the skill of those who preserved it. Through these texts, abstract theological ideas were made tangible, accessible, and visually compelling, helping to transmit beliefs across generations and geographies. The act of copying and embellishing text became a form of devotion, a way to preserve both spiritual and cultural memory in an era where so much could be lost. Religion also mediated daily life in subtle ways. Prayer, ritual, and seasonal observances created a sense of rhythm and order, structuring work, leisure, and community interaction. Moral codes derived from religious teachings guided behavior, regulated justice, and influenced social hierarchy. In villages, monasteries, or courtly centers, faith shaped decisions as mundane as planting cycles or as monumental as declarations of war. The pervasive presence of religion in every facet of life reflects how deeply it informed identity, belonging, and purpose during an era often mischaracterized as dark or chaotic. The interplay between local belief systems and organized Christianity highlights a world of contrasts. In some regions, syncretism softened the edges of conversion, creating hybrid practices that endured for centuries. In others, the Church asserted doctrinal authority, reshaping cultural norms and societal expectations. This dynamic illustrates that early medieval religion was neither monolithic nor static. It was a living, adaptive force, constantly negotiating between continuity and change, between spiritual ideals and human realities. Its influence reached beyond the sacred, shaping governance, culture, and interpersonal relationships in profound and lasting ways. Ultimately, religion served as both a stabilizing and transformative force. It preserved knowledge, provided moral and social guidance, and created networks of connection across a fragmented continent. At the same time, it adapted to local conditions, incorporated elements of older traditions, and interacted with secular authority to shape the emerging medieval world. In examining this intricate tapestry, we see that faith was more than belief. It was a lens through which people understood their world, interpreted uncertainty, and navigated the challenges of survival and governance. The Dark Ages, when viewed through the prism of religion, reveal not emptiness, but a landscape of structure, meaning, and quiet resilience that sustained civilizations through centuries of change. Warfare in the early medieval world was a constant undercurrent, shaping politics, communities, and even culture. The collapse of Roman military structures left a vacuum, and local rulers, tribal leaders, and emerging kings developed new approaches to defense and conquest. Armies were smaller, often composed of levies from local populations rather than professional soldiers, and tactics relied heavily on mobility, surprise, and knowledge of the terrain. Fortifications, ranging from simple wooden palisades to stone keeps, became central to survival, offering protection against raiders, rival lords, and external invaders. The contrast between vulnerability and resilience defines this era. While communities faced frequent threats, their responses were inventive, pragmatic, and often surprisingly effective. Warfare was not only destructive, it shaped the social and political landscapes, influencing alliances, trade, and even cultural exchange. Vikings, Magyars, and Saracens brought new dimensions of threat, mobility, and strategy. Viking longships, capable of navigating both rivers and open seas, allowed sudden raids deep into territories that had previously felt secure. These attacks were unpredictable, often seasonal, and devastating, yet they also stimulated economic and military adaptation. Coastal and riverside communities learned to organize militias, construct watchtowers, and develop early warning systems, illustrating human ingenuity in the face of danger. The same unpredictability characterized Magyar cavalry raids, which relied on speed and maneuverability, striking at the heart of European territories before disappearing as quickly as they arrived. These invasions highlight the interplay between vulnerability and innovation, fear and resilience, that defined the martial culture of the early medieval period. Warfare also had profound political implications. The outcomes of battles and skirmishes could shift alliances, elevate or destroy rulers, and redraw territorial boundaries. Local lords often negotiated power through both force and diplomacy, balancing aggression with strategic marriages, fealty, and tribute. The threat of violence was a constant factor in governance, compelling leaders to maintain armed retainers, fortify settlements, and cultivate loyalty among their followers. Military prowess became intertwined with legitimacy. A ruler's ability to defend territory, project power, or repel invaders was often a measure of authority and prestige. This connection between martial capacity and political stability illustrates how closely intertwined war and governance were in shaping early medieval society. Tactics and technology evolved in response to both opportunity and necessity. Infantry and cavalry formations were adapted to the terrain, climate, and resources available. Siege warfare, though limited compared to later periods, required ingenuity in using earthworks, wooden towers, and battering devices. Weapons, armor, and defensive structures were adapted to balance cost, availability, and effectiveness. Even local militias developed techniques suited to defending villages, fording rivers, and ambushing invaders. This practical, adaptive approach underscores the contrast between the romanticized notions of knightly combat and the everyday realities of survival in a period of constant insecurity. The social impact of warfare was profound. Civilians bore the brunt of raids, sieges, and battles, with communities often displaced, crops destroyed, and livelihoods disrupted. Yet conflict also fostered cohesion, as villages, towns, and regions banded together for mutual protection. Codes of conduct, honor, and loyalty developed within military structures, influencing broader social norms. Raiding and conquest were not only destructive. They facilitated cultural interaction, the spread of technology, and even the movement of ideas and people. The interplay of destruction and adaptation reflects the duality of warfare. It threatened stability, yet it also propelled innovation and social organization. Religion intersected with warfare in ways that amplified both fear and legitimacy. Christian leaders often framed military campaigns in moral or divine terms, portraying defense of territory or faith as a righteous duty. Saints, relics, and prayers were invoked before battles, lending spiritual weight to martial endeavors. Conversely, invasions by non-Christian groups were often depicted as existential threats to both faith and civilization, heightening the sense of danger and urgency. This moral framing of conflict reinforced the intertwining of political, social, and religious life, showing that war was never merely physical. It was also psychological and symbolic. Economically, warfare reshaped trade and resource distribution. Raids could disrupt markets, force migrations, or destroy harvests, yet they also stimulated fortification construction, arms production, and the circulation of loot. Leaders invested in infrastructure that could both defend and facilitate commerce, reflecting the complex relationship between conflict and economic activity. Communities learned to adapt, storing provisions, establishing secure trade routes, and creating networks of refuge and support. The constant tension between threat and opportunity reveals the ingenuity of societies navigating a perilous world. Cultural memory of warfare was preserved in chronicles, epic poetry, and oral traditions. Battles were remembered not only for their strategic importance, but for the human stories they contained: heroism, tragedy, cunning, and betrayal. These narratives reinforced social values, taught lessons about loyalty and courage, and shaped the identities of emerging nations. The intertwining of history and legend created a narrative landscape in which fact and myth coexist, reflecting the duality of reality and perception in early medieval life. Ultimately, warfare in the Dark Ages was both destructive and formative. It demanded innovation, fostered resilience, and shaped the contours of political, social, and cultural life. The era's conflicts reveal a world constantly negotiating between vulnerability and survival, between fear and ingenuity. Far from being a simple age of darkness, this period demonstrates the adaptive capacity of human societies. Communities faced threats, responded creatively, and in doing so laid the groundwork for the more organized military, political, and social structures that would emerge in later medieval Europe. Through the lens of conflict, we gain insight into the resilience, complexity, and determination that characterized this transformative era. Even in the midst of what later generations called the Dark Ages, Europe was far from stagnant. Beneath the quiet villages, crumbling Roman roads, and forests slowly reclaiming abandoned towns, innovation was quietly taking root. Life demanded creativity. Survival required adaptation. And in response, early medieval people developed technologies and systems that would quietly shape the foundations of a future Europe. These innovations, often overlooked in history books, reveal a surprising resilience and ingenuity that thrived in a world commonly thought of as lost to ignorance. Take agriculture, for example. The heavy plow, a seemingly simple implement, transformed farming in northern Europe. While the Mediterranean lands had long relied on light, scratch plows that worked well in soft soils, the heavier, clay-rich soils of northern Europe had remained stubbornly resistant to cultivation. Enter the new plow, fitted with a sharp iron blade and a moldbore that could turn over dense soil with remarkable efficiency. Villages that once struggled to coax crops from stubborn earth could suddenly cultivate larger tracts, supporting growing populations. Fields expanded, villages stabilized, and food supplies became more reliable. This single innovation, quiet and uncelebrated, altered the rhythm of life, allowing communities to persist even amid the political chaos that characterized much of the early medieval world. The horse collar, another subtle yet transformative innovation, worked hand in hand with these agricultural advancements. Before its invention, oxen had been the primary draft animals, slow and strong, but limited in speed and endurance. The new collar allowed horses to pull plows and carts with far less strain, increasing efficiency and opening up new possibilities for trade and travel. Suddenly, goods could move farther and faster. Roads once dormant saw renewed traffic, and the boundaries between regions began to feel less insurmountable. Trade routes slowly reawakened, connecting villages to towns, and towns to emerging centers of craft and learning. What may have seemed like a dark and isolated world was quietly humming with economic ingenuity. But innovation was not limited to agriculture and transportation. Early medieval builders experimented with techniques that would later blossom into the soaring cathedrals of the High Middle Ages. Timber-framed houses, stone bridges, and rudimentary fortifications began to appear across the landscape. Villagers and artisans learned to manage local resources with a precision that reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge, even if the larger intellectual frameworks of Rome had faded. Every bridge laid over a stream, every well dug in a village square, every stone fortification atop a hill reflected a deep understanding of materials, labor, and communal needs. These were innovations born not from libraries or royal edicts, but from practical necessity, tempered by observation, trial, and sometimes trial and error failures that left traces still visible in the archaeological record. Trade, too, evolved in subtle but remarkable ways. River networks, previously mere transportation routes, became lifelines of exchange. Boats and barges were modified to carry heavier loads, sometimes navigating channels that were once thought impassable. Local craftspeople learned to produce goods more efficiently, and markets began to appear regularly, where farmers, artisans, and traders could exchange products and ideas. Even in regions plagued by raids or political fragmentation, networks persisted, quietly knitting communities together. And while no one at the time could have predicted the rise of sprawling medieval towns, these early systems of trade laid the groundwork for the urban revival that would follow centuries later. One of the most fascinating aspects of these innovations is how unevenly they spread. Some regions of Europe leapt forward with new techniques, while neighboring areas remained untouched, seemingly isolated from progress. This unevenness contributes to the enduring mystery of the early medieval world, how knowledge survived, traveled, and sometimes vanished entirely. Monks in remote scriptoria preserved scientific texts from antiquity. Artisans experimented independently with new tools, and farmers adapted local methods to local soil conditions. Innovation was not centralized. It was organic, scattered, and sometimes ephemeral. Its traces are subtle, often visible only to careful observation. An abandoned plow in a peat bog, the remains of a fortified barn, or the unusually straight course of a medieval trade route. Even more intriguing is how these innovations reflect a deep interconnection between necessity, culture, and environment. The heavy plow emerged not because someone envisioned a better Europe, but because communities needed to feed themselves. The horse collar was invented not as a statement of progress, but as a practical response to labor demands. Towns and trade networks arose not from empire, but from the small, persistent efforts of villagers and merchants seeking stability in uncertain times. In other words, Europe's dark centuries were quietly luminous. The ingenuity that blossomed was not always grand or visible at first glance, but it set the stage for the cultural and economic revival that would come centuries later. Perhaps most haunting of all is the sense of loss that accompanies our understanding of this period. Countless inventions, local innovations, and techniques have vanished entirely from the historical record. We know only fragments, tantalizing glimpses of creativity that could have been far more widespread. Archaeologists and historians piece together these clues with patience, reconstructing the invisible scaffolding of medieval life. And yet, even in the gaps, one senses a quiet determination, an undercurrent of human ingenuity that refused to vanish even in the face of political collapse, environmental challenges, and social upheaval. What remains is a world of subtle, practical brilliance hidden beneath the surface, waiting for modern curiosity to illuminate it once more. In contemplating these innovations, it is tempting to impose a modern narrative of progress onto the early medieval world. But this would be a mistake. The world of the Dark Ages did not measure itself against Rome, nor did it anticipate the Renaissance. Its achievements were pragmatic, localized, and often invisible to contemporary chroniclers. Yet their cumulative effect was profound. They stabilized communities, strengthened economies, and provided a quiet continuity that allowed Europe to endure and eventually thrive. In other words, these innovations were small lights in a dim world, flickering quietly, but persistently enough to cast shadows that stretch across the centuries. By the end of this period, Europe had been subtly transformed. Fields tilled more efficiently, horses carried heavier loads, villages were fortified, rivers flowed with renewed commerce, and knowledge, though fragile, had survived in the hands of a few dedicated keepers. The Dark Ages, for all their hardships and uncertainties, were not simply a void between the classical and medieval worlds. They were a landscape of human ingenuity, quietly preparing the soil for the flowering of later centuries. And as the story continues, these hidden sparks of progress set the stage for the brief renaissance of learning under Charlemagne, and for the slow but steady emergence of towns, trade, and culture that would begin to dispel the darkness entirely. The early 9th century witnessed a remarkable figure whose life and ambition would briefly illuminate Europe's fragmented landscape. Charlemagne, known to some as Charles the Great, emerged as both warrior and statesman, scholar and ruler, embodying a paradox that seems to bridge the perceived darkness of the early medieval world with a hint of Renaissance. His reign was not merely a series of conquests. It was an experiment in resurrecting the past, reimagining the present, and shaping a future that could withstand the constant pressures of fragmentation and uncertainty. To understand Charlemagne's impact, one must first step into the quiet rhythms of his empire, where illuminated manuscripts, palace schools, and distant villages coexisted in a delicate balance of order and disorder. At the heart of Charlemagne's vision was a desire to unify the sprawling territories under his control, bringing coherence to lands that had long known only local allegiances. He extended the Frankish domain across much of Western and Central Europe, encompassing regions that now belonged to France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. But unification was never merely political. It was cultural, religious, and intellectual. The Carolingian Renaissance, as historians call it, was less an era of grandiose innovation and more a deliberate effort to preserve and standardize knowledge, laws, and religious practices. Charlemagne recognized that power alone could not sustain an empire. Education, literacy, and moral order were equally necessary, even if their benefits would take decades to fully materialize. One of the most striking manifestations of this vision was the establishment of palace schools, the most famous of which was located at Aachen. Here, scholars from across Europe were invited to teach, copy manuscripts, and advise on governance. The palace became a quiet hub of intellectual activity, a place where scribes labored over texts by candlelight, preserving works from antiquity and producing new commentaries. Classical Latin, once slipping into decline, was revived as the language of administration, liturgy, and learning. Charlemagne's insistence on literacy among his officials and clergy was not just a practical measure. It was a statement of intent. Knowledge, he understood, could stabilize rule, strengthen faith, and create a subtle continuity with the Roman past. Yet even in this cultivated environment, many mysteries remained. Some texts were lost, some teachings forgotten, and some decisions were left undocumented, leaving historians today to wonder at what may have flourished unseen. Beyond the palace walls, Charlemagne's influence touched the lives of countless ordinary people. His military campaigns brought both security and disruption. On one hand, they curbed the invasions of Vikings, Slavs, and other groups pressing into European territories. On the other, conquest often entailed forced assimilation, taxation, and strict enforcement of Christian orthodoxy. Monasteries became centers not only of faith but of learning, spreading literacy into remote regions, copying manuscripts, and educating the clergy. Towns and villages, in turn, became increasingly linked by roads and administrative systems that were remarkably sophisticated for their time. The empire, though vast, relied on a network of counts, dukes, and local administrators to maintain order, creating a sense of unity that stretched across diverse cultures, languages, and landscapes. Charlemagne's reign also reflected a deep, if sometimes enigmatic, relationship between power and faith. He was crowned Emperor of the Romans in 800 AD by Pope Leo III, a symbolic act that fused secular authority with spiritual endorsement. This coronation was not just ceremonial. It signaled a bold claim to revive the grandeur of Rome while establishing a distinctly Christian political identity. The fusion of empire and faith created both strength and tension, as Charlemagne's successors would later discover. While he sought to standardize religious practices, enforce moral codes, and promote learning, the practical implementation varied widely across regions. Local customs persisted, sometimes quietly subverting official decrees, reminding us that even the greatest rulers are constrained by geography, culture, and human unpredictability. An often overlooked aspect of Charlemagne's era is the subtle experimentation with administration and governance. He introduced measures to audit officials, standardize weights and measures, and regulate trade. Missi Dominici, royal envoys sent to oversee local administration, traveled on horseback across the empire, inspecting justice, taxes, and compliance with imperial law. These envoys created a form of accountability that, while imperfect, represented an extraordinary effort to maintain cohesion over vast distances. It is remarkable to imagine these circuits of inspection, the messengers riding quietly through forests and mountains, carrying orders and intelligence from the emperor, ensuring that even remote villages remained tethered to the larger vision of empire. Yet despite these achievements, Charlemagne's empire was fragile, dependent on his personal presence, intellect, and force of will. In many ways, it was a fleeting brilliance, a candle glowing in the long shadow of the Dark Ages. After his death, the empire fragmented under the weight of familial divisions and regional pressures. Yet the legacy of his rule endured in subtle ways. The preservation of knowledge, the promotion of literacy, and the establishment of administrative practices that would influence European governance for centuries. Charlemagne's era reminds us that even in periods we label dark, there can be moments of extraordinary illumination, fragile yet profound, shaping the future in ways invisible to contemporaries. Perhaps the most enduring mystery of Charlemagne's reign lies in what might have been lost or overlooked. Scholars continue to debate the extent of the Carolingian Renaissance, how widespread literacy truly was, how effective administrative reforms became, and which innovations were organic versus imposed. Archaeological discoveries occasionally hint at unknown centers of learning, forgotten manuscripts, or relics of cultural exchange that suggest a far more complex picture than traditional narratives allow. Even the empire's military campaigns, so well documented in annals, leave gaps, accounts missing, motivations obscured, and countless ordinary lives left unrecorded. These shadows, much like the broader Dark Ages themselves, invite curiosity, speculation, and a quiet recognition that history is never fully knowable. Charlemagne's reign, in essence, was a bridge between the shadows of the early medieval world and the emerging light of Europe's later centuries. It combined the practical and the visionary, the martial and the scholarly, the temporal and the spiritual. Under his rule, the scattered fragments of post-Roman Europe coalesced into a fragile unity, illuminated by the quiet efforts of scribes, scholars, and administrators. And while this unity proved temporary, it created a foundation that would influence European identity for generations. In reflecting on Charlemagne's life, we gain not only insight into the man himself, but also into the enduring capacity of human societies to innovate, preserve, and aspire, even when the world seems uncertain and dim. As the candlelight flickers in the quiet halls of Aachen, and the scribes bend over their parchment, we glimpse a civilization striving to hold onto knowledge and order amid the vast unknown. This is the essence of Charlemagne's contribution, a moment of deliberate illumination, a renaissance before the Renaissance, casting long shadows that invite both admiration and contemplation. And as we follow the empire's eventual fragmentation, we carry with us the sense that the Dark Ages were not simply an interval of decline, but a canvas where human resilience, ingenuity, and vision quietly painted the outlines of a future yet to come. The death of Charlemagne in 814 marked the end of a rare moment of unity in Europe, and with it came a subtle unraveling that would quietly reshape the continent. While his reign had briefly stitched together sprawling territories under a single vision, the forces of fragmentation, so long dormant, reasserted themselves. The empire, vast and diverse, had depended so heavily on his presence, his authority, and his personal charisma that once he was gone, cracks began to appear almost immediately. Local rulers, ambitious and cautious in equal measure, asserted their influence, testing the boundaries of autonomy against the remnants of imperial oversight. What had once seemed stable now trembled under the weight of human ambition and historical circumstance. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 formalized what had already begun to take shape, the division of Charlemagne's empire among his grandsons. Lothair received the Central Territories, Louis the German the Eastern lands, and Charles the Bald the Western domains. On paper, it was a solution, a compromise aimed at preventing outright civil war. In practice, it set the stage for centuries of regional rivalry, border disputes, and shifting alliances. The map of Europe became a patchwork of kingdoms, principalities, and duchies, each pursuing its own interests, each interpreting Charlemagne's legacy differently. While some continuity remained in law, administration, and religion, the cohesion of his reign dissolved gradually, like mist lifting from a valley at dawn. This period of division is often described in stark terms, decay, disorder, and the reassertion of the so-called darkness. Yet beneath these generalizations, life continued with a quiet rhythm, shaped by local needs and inherited practices. The very administrative structures Charlemagne had built, counts, missi dominici, and regional oversight, persisted in altered forms. Communities found ways to adapt, creating new networks of loyalty, trade, and cultural exchange. In some ways, the empire's fragmentation encouraged innovation. Local leaders developed strategies to protect their territories, improve agricultural production, and negotiate complex relationships with neighbors. What might appear as collapse from a distance was often a more nuanced process, a slow rebalancing rather than an abrupt decline. Even as political unity faltered, the Carolingian Renaissance left a lingering imprint. Monasteries continued to preserve knowledge, copying manuscripts and educating local elites. Churches maintained literacy and record-keeping, ensuring that the empire's intellectual spark did not vanish entirely. In rural villages, peasants tilled their fields according to methods refined over decades, quietly benefiting from agricultural innovations introduced during Charlemagne's reign. Roads and river routes still carried goods and messages, and local markets facilitated commerce. Civilization, though dispersed, endured. The fragmentation of authority created a mosaic rather than a void, a pattern that would later define much of medieval Europe. The personal ambitions and rivalries among Charlemagne's descendants added layers of unpredictability. Alliances shifted, feuds emerged, and borders remained fluid. Historians today still debate the extent to which these divisions were inevitable, or whether a different succession might have preserved more centralized control. Contemporary chronicles often focus on wars and disputes, yet within these narratives lie hints of resilience. Communities that survived sieges, leaders who forged alliances across linguistic and cultural divides, and scholars who quietly carried forward the intellectual legacy of the Carolingian court. The interplay of fragility and continuity creates a subtle tension, a sense that the empire's unity was never absolute, yet its influence endured far beyond its political lifespan. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of this period is the delicate balance between memory and reality. Charlemagne's reign became a touchstone, a standard against which fragmentation was measured. Chroniclers, monks, and later historians contrasted the emperor's era of illumination with the uncertainty that followed, often exaggerating the chaos of his successors to highlight the brilliance of his leadership. Yet in this contrast, we glimpse the deeper truth. History is rarely black and white. Even in times of division, knowledge, culture, and innovation continue to survive, quietly threading continuity through apparent disorder. The empire's disintegration reminds us that human societies are resilient, finding ways to endure and adapt even when the structures that once held them together begin to falter. As Europe settled into this new era of regional kingdoms, the stage was set for further upheavals, raids, migrations, and political experimentation that would define the next centuries. The fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire, while initially a source of uncertainty and tension, allowed for the emergence of distinctive cultural identities, localized governance, and adaptive strategies that prepared Europe for both challenges and opportunities. In this period, the lessons of unity, innovation, and administration passed down from Charlemagne's reign became invisible threads, weaving through the patchwork of kingdoms, quietly guiding the continent toward the next wave of historical transformation. The centuries following the fragmentation of Charlemagne's empire were marked by uncertainty, and Europe's borders became fluid landscapes of opportunity and peril. From the north, the Vikings emerged, masters of both sea and shadow, their longships gliding silently along rivers and coastlines. To the east, the Magyars pressed into the heart of Central Europe, swift and unpredictable on horseback, leaving traces of fear and fascination in their wake. From the south, the expansion of Islamic powers across the Mediterranean brought both conflict and exchange, reshaping commerce, culture, and diplomacy. This was not an era defined solely by destruction. It was an age of movement, adaptation, and subtle transformation, where the known and unknown coexisted in delicate tension. The Vikings, in particular, have been cast in legend as marauders and destroyers, their names whispered in fear. Yet beneath the tales of raids and burning villages lies a more nuanced story. Vikings were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their journeys stretched from the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the rivers of Russia, the shores of England, and even as far as the Iberian Peninsula. The longships themselves were marvels of design, sleek, shallow-drafted, capable of navigating both open sea and narrow inland waterways. These vessels enabled swift raids, yes, but they also facilitated commerce and cultural exchange. The Viking influence is visible not only in chronicles of pillage, but in the integration of technology, trade goods, and even place names across vast regions of Europe. Communities adapted to their presence, fortifying settlements, forming alliances, and learning the rhythms of maritime life. In this way, the Vikings became both a threat and a catalyst, pushing societies toward innovation and resilience. Eastward, the Magyars presented a different kind of challenge. Mounted archers paraded across the open plains, their mobility unmatched, their intentions often mysterious. Settlements along river valleys and fertile plains faced sudden incursions, prompting defensive strategies that would influence local military organization for generations. Yet the Magyars were also traders and settlers. Over time, they transitioned from raiders to rulers of the Carpathian Basin, establishing a kingdom that blended local traditions with their own. Their arrival is a reminder that migrations and invasions were rarely monolithic. They brought instability, certainly, but they also introduced new cultures, technologies, and ideas into the European fabric. From the south, the Mediterranean remained a conduit of both fear and fascination. Islamic powers, having advanced across North Africa and the Iberian Peninsula, maintained sophisticated networks of trade, scholarship, and diplomacy. The arrival of Islamic merchants, scholars, and artisans brought Europe into contact with advanced mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and art. While political and military tensions existed, the flow of ideas and goods also enriched European communities, linking them to a broader, interconnected world. Ships carried silks, spices, and texts, creating subtle channels of influence that would echo for centuries. Even in moments of conflict, Europe was not isolated. It was a continent in motion, absorbing, resisting, and adapting to influences from every direction. Amid these pressures, local societies developed strategies for survival and resilience. Fortified towns, castles, and river defenses emerged as practical responses to the persistent threat of raiders. Local leaders learned to negotiate, pay tribute, or form alliances with invading forces, sometimes turning enemies into collaborators. Communities strengthened internal cohesion, relying on social networks and kinship ties to withstand external pressures. Life became a careful negotiation between fear and adaptation, between known patterns and the unpredictability of outside forces. In this landscape, survival was itself a form of quiet innovation, a testament to human ingenuity in uncertain times. Trade and communication persisted despite the chaos, creating unexpected connections. Rivers and coasts became highways of exchange, linking northern, eastern, and southern Europe in a delicate web. Markets flourished where possible, often in the shadow of fortifications, allowing goods and ideas to move even amid political instability. Artisans continued to craft, farmers continued to cultivate, and scribes continued to preserve knowledge. In this way, Europe's intellectual and economic life quietly endured, even as the continent faced external pressures that might have seemed insurmountable. The contrast between chaos and continuity, between fear and adaptation, creates a tension that defines this period, an era in which the unknown shaped every aspect of daily life. Yet the invasions of this era were not only practical challenges, they were also the source of enduring mysteries. How did small communities survive repeated raids? How did knowledge, trade, and cultural practices endure amid waves of displacement and conflict? Archaeological evidence hints at settlements rebuilt in precise patterns, hidden trade routes, and strategic fortifications, but much remains unknown. Oral histories, sagas, and chronicles offer tantalizing glimpses, yet they are often incomplete, colored by fear, myth, or ideological intent. The gaps in our understanding remind us that history is often shaped as much by what is lost or hidden as by what is recorded. By the end of this period, the combined pressures of Viking, Magyar, and Southern incursions had reshaped Europe in profound ways. Political structures became more localized, defense mechanisms became sophisticated, and cultural exchange became inevitable. Communities learned to balance threat and opportunity, drawing lessons from both victory and loss. The invasions, paradoxically, accelerated adaptation, encouraging innovation in agriculture, warfare, governance, and trade. They also reinforced the fragility and resilience of human societies, illustrating how even amidst fear and uncertainty, life not only continues, but finds ways to thrive. In reflecting on the invasion age, it is important to recognize the duality of experience. Europe experienced fear and upheaval, yet also remarkable resilience and ingenuity. Raiders became traders, invaders became settlers, and conflict became a catalyst for adaptation. The known world of villages, towns, and emerging kingdoms constantly negotiated with the unknown forces pressing against its borders. And in this quiet negotiation, Europe began to evolve, laying the foundations for the relative stability, cultural richness, and economic revival that would characterize the later Middle Ages. What appears at first glance as a period of darkness was, in truth, a dynamic era of movement, challenge, and subtle transformation, a time when the continent learned to navigate both the shadow and the light. As the dust of invasions settled and Europe began to stabilize, a new social and political order quietly emerged from the fragments of earlier kingdoms and empires. This system, later called feudalism, was not imposed overnight by grand plan. It evolved organically, a pragmatic response to the insecurity, uncertainty, and dispersed authority that characterized the post-Carolingian world. In many ways, feudalism was a reflection of necessity. Communities needed protection, rulers required loyalty, and both sought a measure of predictability in a landscape that remained punctuated by raids, rivalries, and unpredictable events. It was a subtle, intricate web of relationships, often informal and personal, that provided structure where centralized governance had faltered. At the heart of feudal society was the relationship between lord and vassal. Lords, often local landowners or former Carolingian officials, controlled territories, providing protection and justice within their domains. Vassals, in turn, pledged loyalty and military service, forming bonds that were simultaneously practical and symbolic. These relationships were reinforced through ceremonies, oaths, and ritual, creating a sense of order and mutual obligation that extended beyond mere contract. Far from the rigid hierarchy later imagined, early feudal bonds were flexible, negotiated, and highly localized. Each manor, each castle, each village had its own rhythms, reflecting the particular balance of power, custom, and environment. What emerges is not a monolithic system, but a patchwork of human ingenuity, social adaptation, and cautious negotiation. The peasants who lived under this system formed the backbone of society, though their lives were often defined by labor, seasonal cycles, and obligations to the land. Serfs were tied to the manor, cultivating fields, tending livestock, and providing the goods and services necessary for local survival. Their work, while unglamorous, sustained communities and allowed for the slow accumulation of wealth, stability, and cultural continuity. At the same time, they were not entirely without agency. Local customs, seasonal festivals, and the rhythms of village life created spaces for social cohesion, negotiation, and resilience. Peasant communities became adept at navigating the obligations of lords, the demands of climate, and the pressures of external threats, maintaining life in continuity even as larger political structures shifted around them. Castles and fortified settlements became the visible markers of feudal authority and protection. Though they might seem imposing today, these structures were initially practical, serving as refuges in times of danger and centers of local administration. Walls, towers, and gates provided security against raiders and rival lords, while keeps and manorial halls functioned as hubs of governance, storage, and communal decision-making. The architecture itself reflected a combination of inherited Roman techniques, practical experimentation, and local adaptation to resources and terrain. In these fortifications, we see both ingenuity and the subtle interplay between defense, authority, and everyday life, quietly demonstrating how human societies adapt to uncertainty with creativity and forethought. Feudalism also shaped the economy in ways that were both practical and profound. Agricultural innovation continued, building on techniques developed during the Carolingian era and refined to meet local needs. Crop rotation, the heavy plow, and improved animal husbandry increased yields, while markets and local fairs allowed for the exchange of goods, ideas, and skills. Lords collected rent and labor obligations, but they also had an interest in maintaining productive, resilient communities. The system encouraged stability in an otherwise unpredictable world, balancing coercion with incentives, protection with expectation. In this sense, feudal society was not merely hierarchical. It was adaptive, a framework through which both rulers and subjects navigated the uncertainties of early medieval life. The spread of feudalism was uneven, reflecting the patchwork nature of post-Carolingian Europe. Some regions, like northern France or parts of Germany, developed complex networks of lords, vassals, and fortified manors relatively quickly. In other areas, local customs persisted, blending pre-existing traditions with a new system of obligations and protection. This unevenness created a dynamic, fluid landscape in which innovation and adaptation thrived. Local leaders experimented with administrative practices, military organization, and social hierarchy, responding to immediate pressures while shaping the long-term evolution of governance. In this way, the early feudal world was a laboratory of political and social ingenuity, quietly preparing the continent for future stability and growth. Religion played a subtle but central role in reinforcing feudal structures. The church, itself a repository of knowledge and authority, mediated disputes, blessed alliances, and provided moral legitimacy to both rulers and vassals. Monasteries and parish churches became centers of education, record-keeping, and social organization. Clergy often acted as advisors, scribes, and mediators, integrating spiritual authority into the practical workings of everyday life. In doing so, the Church created a continuity that bridged centuries of political fragmentation, preserving literacy, law, and cultural memory. The intertwining of spiritual and temporal authority added a layer of cohesion to a world otherwise defined by localism and uncertainty. Perhaps most intriguing about the rise of feudal Europe is the sense of quiet resilience it represents. While chroniclers often emphasize the apparent decline of central authority, the reality was more subtle. Communities found ways to protect themselves, maintain production, and navigate the obligations imposed by lords and vassals. Authority became localized, yes, but also more tangible and immediate. Social bonds, practical knowledge, and shared customs created continuity across generations, allowing society to persist and slowly evolve. The perceived darkness of the era is therefore tempered by these threads of stability, ingenuity, and adaptability, qualities that would quietly underpin the eventual revival of towns, trade, and intellectual life in later centuries. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that feudalism was less a rigid imposition than a delicate negotiation between necessity and opportunity. Lords, vassals, and peasants created a web of obligations and protections that allowed life to continue amid uncertainty. Fortifications, agricultural practices, trade networks, and religious institutions all contributed to a subtle coherence, a quiet order emerging from apparent chaos. The world of early feudal Europe was not static. It was dynamic, adaptive, and deeply human. It reminds us that even in periods commonly labeled as dark, societies can innovate, endure, and lay the foundations for a brighter future. By the end of this era, Europe had transformed from a patchwork of fragmented territories into a continent capable of sustaining complex social, political, and economic systems. Feudalism, for all its imperfections and regional variations, provided the structure necessary for continuity, security, and incremental innovation. Villages thrived, markets connected communities, fortifications protected inhabitants, and local leadership cultivated resilience. The era quietly prepared Europe for the gradual flowering of towns, commerce, and culture, bridging the gap between the shadows of the early medieval period and the emerging light of the High Middle Ages. In this slow, almost imperceptible way, the continent learned to navigate the uncertainties of life in the centuries after Charlemagne, setting the stage for both stability and transformation. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, Europe was beginning to stir with a quiet energy that would gradually dispel the shadows of earlier centuries. Towns that had long been modest market settlements began to flourish, while trade routes, once precarious and unreliable, now carried goods, ideas, and people with increasing regularity. This period, often overlooked in traditional histories of the Dark Ages, was characterized by subtle yet profound transformations. The known world was expanding, not through empire building or conquest alone, but through the gentle growth of commerce, the careful construction of infrastructure, and the gradual emergence of civic institutions. The continent, once fragmented, began to hum with activity, hinting at the brighter days to come. One of the most visible signs of this awakening was the growth of towns and urban centers. Many had their origins in fortified villages or monasteries, yet by this time they had become hubs of trade, craft, and social interaction. Streets, often narrow and winding, were lined with workshops, homes, and markets where merchants exchanged everything from textiles and metalwork to spices and grain. Town walls offered protection, but within them, life flourished in a rhythm both practical and communal. Artisans refined their crafts over generations, passing techniques quietly from master to apprentice, producing objects of surprising sophistication. The towns were not only economic centers, but also cultural spaces, where ideas mingled, innovations were tested, and the foundations of civic life quietly solidified. Trade, increasingly sophisticated, became the lifeblood of these communities. River networks, roads, and coastal routes allowed goods to move with greater efficiency than in earlier centuries. Markets became regular events, attracting not only local peasants, but also merchants traveling from distant regions. Cities like Bruges, Venice, and Lubeck would eventually emerge as iconic examples. Yet even smaller towns played critical roles in linking local economies. Trade fostered not only material exchange, but also the movement of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. The arrival of new goods, a fine cloth, a mechanical tool, or a book, was accompanied by subtle exchanges in knowledge, skill, and technique. The continent was, in effect, knitting itself together, thread by thread, through networks that combined necessity with curiosity. Alongside trade, social and legal innovations quietly shaped urban life. Towns often received charters granting privileges, self-governance, and protection from local lords. These charters created a form of autonomy that encouraged civic responsibility, dispute resolution, and the development of local governance structures. Citizens, whether merchants, artisans, or property holders became participants in shaping their own communities. While the scale and influence of these institutions varied, they reflected a growing awareness that stability and prosperity required coordination, law, and shared norms. In essence, the towns became microcosms of order amid a continent still negotiating the balance between local power and emerging regional identities. Agricultural improvements continued to support this urban resurgence. Enhanced techniques, including crop rotation, improved plowing, and selective breeding of livestock, ensured a surplus of food sufficient to feed both rural and urban populations. Surplus production allowed some individuals to leave the fields and devote themselves to craft, trade, or administration, fueling the growth of towns. Roads and bridges, maintained either by local lords, guilds, or emerging municipal authorities, facilitated movement, connecting distant villages to thriving market centers. These improvements, while often incremental and localized, created the necessary conditions for the gradual transformation of Europe from a patchwork of isolated communities into a network of interconnected economies. Cultural life, too, was quietly revived in this era. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved literacy, copied manuscripts, and educated clergy and select laity. The transmission of knowledge was uneven, yet it created pockets of intellectual continuity that bridged centuries. Artisans and builders experimented with architectural techniques, leading to the early development of stone churches, market halls, and bridges. Religious festivals, local fairs, and communal gatherings reinforced social cohesion, creating shared experiences that helped communities navigate periods of uncertainty. Through these subtle but persistent efforts, towns became not only centers of commerce, but also spaces of identity, memory, and aspiration. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is the interplay between the local and the broader world. Even modest towns were not entirely isolated. Rivers, roads, and trade networks connected them to larger cultural and economic spheres. Ideas, goods, and people moved along these routes, often in surprising ways. A new type of plow might be seen in a village hundreds of miles from its origin. Exotic spices from distant lands could find their way into a market square, accompanied by stories, techniques, and knowledge that enriched local life. These exchanges remind us that even in a world without centralized empires, human societies are never truly static. Connections, practical, cultural, and intellectual, persist, bridging distances and creating opportunities for subtle transformation. The rise of towns also heralded the slow emergence of more formal social structures, including early guilds. Artisans organized into associations to regulate trade, ensure quality, and protect shared interests. These guilds became the foundation for professional and economic organization, fostering stability, skill transmission, and collective identity. Participation in guild life also reinforced social cohesion, creating networks that extended beyond family and village. In a world still shadowed by the memory of fragmentation and invasion, these structures provided continuity, security, and a sense of shared purpose. By the end of this period, Europe had begun to emerge from the long shadows of the Dark Ages. Towns and trade, while still evolving, provided the first hints of a more interconnected, prosperous, and dynamic continent. Knowledge, skill, and culture moved with commerce, linking disparate regions into a tapestry of human activity. The quiet resilience of villages, the ingenuity of artisans, and the careful stewardship of religious and civic institutions all contributed to this subtle renewal. This awakening was not sudden or dramatic, but incremental, built upon centuries of adaptation, survival, and innovation. It was a dawn that would gradually brighten, leading toward the flowering of cities, universities, and cultural achievement in the High Middle Ages. In reflecting on this period, it becomes clear that Europe's return to light was neither inevitable nor linear. It was the product of countless small efforts, often invisible to contemporary chroniclers, yet cumulatively transformative. Markets thrived, streets bustled, and rivers carried goods and ideas, weaving together communities that had once seemed isolated. Life, in its quiet persistence, prepared the continent for the future, demonstrating that even in eras traditionally labeled dark, continuity, ingenuity, and hope quietly endure. The first dawn of towns, trade, and renewed cultural life set the stage for the final centuries of medieval Europe, reminding us that light can emerge slowly, steadily, and almost imperceptibly, even after the longest shadows. As Europe gradually emerged from the centuries-long shadow of fragmentation and uncertainty, a curious perception began to take hold, one that would shape the way later generations remembered the past. Scholars of the Renaissance, reflecting on the contrast between their own era of revived learning and the centuries that preceded it, coined the term Dark Ages to describe the period between the fall of Rome and the emergence of medieval revival. The phrase, evocative and enduring, suggested a world of ignorance, stagnation, and cultural decay. Yet the reality was far more nuanced, revealing a delicate interplay of survival, adaptation, and quiet innovation that contradicts the stark darkness implied by the label. The perception of darkness was shaped, in part, by Renaissance ideals and biases. Scholars like Petrarch and other humanists, steeped in classical admiration, viewed the medieval centuries as a period of decline from the heights of Roman civilization. Manuscripts, art, and architecture of their own time, suffused with rediscovered classical ideals, stood in contrast to what seemed to be a simpler, rougher, and less refined earlier Europe. By emphasizing loss and ignorance, these commentators elevated their own cultural moment, framing history as a moral and intellectual contrast. In doing so, they inadvertently obscured the resilience, ingenuity, and quiet accomplishments of the centuries they dismissed. Yet the evidence of continuity and innovation in the so-called Dark Ages is abundant, if subtle. Agricultural improvements, such as the heavy plow and advanced crop rotation, ensured the survival and slow growth of communities. Monasteries preserved knowledge, copied manuscripts, and educated clergy and select laity, creating pockets of literacy that endured across generations. Trade networks, both local and long-distance, carried goods, ideas, and cultural practices, linking towns, villages, and emerging urban centers. Artisans refined their crafts, building structures and producing goods that reflected both practicality and skill. Even in periods of political fragmentation, society demonstrated a capacity for adaptation, cooperation, and incremental progress that challenges the narrative of universal decline. The contrast between perception and reality highlights a fascinating tension in historical memory. The so-called darkness was not uniform. It varied regionally, temporally, and socially. Some areas experienced profound disruption, while others maintained stability and continuity. Cultural and intellectual life persisted in monasteries, courts, and marketplaces, though often in forms different from classical expectations. The Renaissance lens, focused on classical ideals, tended to obscure these achievements, creating a sense of absence that was more interpretive than factual. In essence, the Dark Ages were partially a construct, a narrative shaped as much by the expectations and biases of later observers as by the realities of the medieval world itself. Moreover, the label obscures the complex interplay of light and shadow that characterized the period. Even amid uncertainty, communities experimented with governance, cultivated trade, innovated in agriculture, and preserved cultural memory. Periods of upheaval, such as invasions or political fragmentation, coexisted with moments of quiet growth, adaptation, and intellectual activity. The tension between loss and continuity, between crisis and resilience, is what makes this era so fascinating to study. It is not a monolithic darkness, but a landscape of nuanced contrasts, where survival and creativity quietly illuminate the centuries. Recognizing this complexity allows us to reconsider our assumptions about medieval Europe. Rather than viewing it as a void between Rome and the Renaissance, we can appreciate it as a period of transformation, innovation, and subtle preparation for later achievements. Knowledge survived in careful hands. Ideas circulated through trade and travel, and communities adapted to both opportunity and threat. The so-called Dark Ages were, in reality, a tapestry of continuity and change, of shadowed valleys and flickering lights, where the seeds of future prosperity were quietly sown. By examining history through this lens, we can see how human societies endure, adapt, and innovate, even when the world seems uncertain or obscured. Ultimately, the invention of the Dark Ages serves as both a caution and a guide. It reminds us that historical narratives are often shaped by perspective, ideology, and hindsight. It also invites us to look closer, to notice the subtle threads of resilience, creativity, and survival that persist even in times labeled as dark. The period was not one of uniform stagnation, but a dynamic, adaptive, and quietly inventive landscape, where continuity and change coexisted in a delicate balance. In understanding this, we gain a deeper appreciation of Europe's long journey from fragmentation to renewal, and of the enduring human capacity to find light even in shadowed times. As we arrive at the close of this journey through centuries often misunderstood, it becomes clear that the story of the so-called Dark Ages is neither simple nor absolute. It is a story of contrasts, shadow and light, loss and preservation, fragmentation and resilience. The label itself, Dark Ages, suggests a void, a period where knowledge, culture, and human ingenuity vanished. Yet, as we have seen, the reality was far more complex. Across Europe, life persisted. Communities adapted, innovated, and endured. Monks preserved fragile manuscripts by candlelight. Farmers tilled stubborn soil with ever-improving techniques, and artisans refined their crafts, passing knowledge quietly from generation to generation. These quiet achievements remind us that even in times labeled as dark, the human spirit continues to create, to preserve, and to aspire. History, after all, is rarely linear. Events do not unfold in neat progressions or guaranteed patterns. The centuries between Rome and the High Middle Ages were marked by uncertainty, by invasions and migrations, by the rise and fall of empires and kingdoms. Yet even amid upheaval, the subtle threads of continuity endured. Roads remained in use, rivers still carried trade, and literacy survived in monasteries and courts. Innovations in agriculture, technology, and governance spread slowly but steadily. Over time, these threads wove together, laying the foundations for the revival of towns, the emergence of trade networks, and the flowering of learning that would define later medieval Europe. In this sense, the so-called darkness was never complete. It was punctuated by sparks of resilience and ingenuity that would illuminate the centuries to come. Perhaps the most fascinating element of this period is the interplay between what was known and what was lost. Knowledge survived in fragments, texts copied by careful hands, architectural techniques passed through practice, social customs quietly maintained in villages. At the same time, countless works vanished, leaving tantalizing gaps in the historical record. We are left to wonder about the ideas, inventions, and cultural practices that might have flourished but were never recorded, or that vanished with the passage of time. This tension between presence and absence creates the enduring mystery of early medieval Europe. It is a reminder that history is as much about what is missing as what survives, and that the human story is often written in subtle, almost invisible strokes rather than in grandiose, unbroken lines. The centuries of the early Middle Ages also teach us about adaptation and survival. Human societies face threats from external invasion, environmental challenges, and internal disorder. Yet they found ways to endure. Fortifications, local governance, and feudal bonds provided protection and stability. Trade routes reopened, linking distant regions in networks of exchange. Cultural and religious institutions mediated disputes, preserved knowledge, and provided a sense of moral and social order. Each adaptation was a quiet act of resilience, demonstrating the capacity of communities to find stability and continuity amid uncertainty. It is within these subtle adaptations that the true story of the so-called Dark Ages emerges, not as a tale of universal decline, but as a chronicle of survival, creativity, and transformation. Reflection also reveals how perception shapes history. Later generations, particularly during the Renaissance, painted these centuries as a void to highlight the brilliance of their own era. The narrative of darkness became self-reinforcing, obscuring the achievements, networks, and adaptations that persisted across Europe. Yet when we look closely, we find that life continued, knowledge endured, and subtle innovation quietly paved the way for the vibrant medieval world that followed. The contrast between perception and reality offers a profound lesson. The stories we inherit about the past are filtered through perspective, bias, and memory. Understanding the past requires patience, attention to nuance, and a willingness to see the light in unexpected places. Ultimately, the Dark Ages were a landscape of shadow and illumination, a complex tapestry where human resilience quietly endured. It was a time when ordinary lives mattered as much as grand empires, when the labor of peasants, the ingenuity of artisans, and the diligence of scribes sustained culture and knowledge across generations. It was a period in which survival depended not solely on might or conquest, but on the persistent rhythms of daily life, the careful stewardship of knowledge, and the delicate negotiation of social bonds. These centuries remind us that light often exists in quiet, almost imperceptible ways, an insight particularly comforting for those listening as night falls, inviting contemplation, calm, and reflection. As we draw this exploration to a close, we are left with a sense of wonder at the resilience and creativity of human societies. The so-called Dark Ages were not a period of void or decay, but a time of subtle growth, adaptation, and preparation for the brighter centuries that followed. Knowledge, innovation, and culture persisted, sometimes hidden, sometimes fragile, but always enduring. The centuries between Rome and the High Middle Ages were a quiet prelude, a shadowed interlude in which human ingenuity survived the trials of uncertainty and laid the foundation for future flourishing. In the end, the story of the Dark Ages reminds us that history is never fully knowable, and yet the traces of the past speak eloquently to the endurance of human creativity. The shadows of the era are real, yet they are interwoven with moments of illumination, agricultural innovation, the preservation of texts, the rise of towns, and the quiet resilience of communities. It is within these contrasts that we find the essence of human persistence, the ability to survive, adapt, and create meaning even in times of uncertainty. As the night deepens, we can rest with the knowledge that history, much like life itself, is a tapestry of shadows and light, each feeding the other, each revealing the extraordinary resilience of humanity in its quiet, enduring ways.